Okay, today my guest is Professor Mary Yoko Brannen. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Mary Yoko as a person and Professor Brannen as a thought leader and an esteemed scholar, and as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. And Mary Yoko is a fellow at the AIB and was a deputy editor for JIBS for quite some time, I think two consecutive terms.
That's right.
And she's an expert in cross-cultural management. Let me take a look at my notes. Ethnomethodology and qualitative studies of complex cultural organization phenomena. So thank you, Mary Yoko, for joining us.
My pleasure.
I'm curious about what did you want to become when you were a child?
I really wanted to become an oceanographer. I wanted to work for Jacques Cousteau as a marine biologist.
Oh,
And from an early age, I did scuba diving. And I even, when I was 16, I took scuba diving lessons in France, in Paris, from the Jacques Cousteau Society, because this was my goal in life, to be an oceanographer.
when I was growing up, he was a hit. He was the biggest thing in my age group, and I actually have a red hat because of his. I was influenced by his red hat.
Uh-huh.
Too bad he died.
I
So
don't have a red hat.
I felt important, and I felt like, okay. So, can you pinpoint the earliest moment of awareness between domestic and international or foreign, um, which will lead to your IB scholarship?
Well, that's very easy. I was born in Japan, and I was born in the 1950s. So not very long after World War II, you know. And we were the only non-Japanese where I was growing up on a small island outside of Hiroshima. And so from the time I can remember, people would point at me and say that I was foreign. Gaijin da, they'd say, I'm a foreigner. And so from as early as I can remember, I remember that I was foreign. And so I knew what foreign was.
So, what pushed you to be a IB scholar?
Well, that really is not a direct route at all, because as I said, I was much more interested in science. And in fact, when I went to college, it was the first time being in the United States, going to the United States, knowing that, well, I had no choice because Japan doesn't recognize citizenship from birth. And so if you're not Japanese by blood, then you would have to go to your country of citizenship when you become an adult. And so my parents were missionaries in Japan, and like other missionary children, we had to go to the United States for college. And for most of us, it was quite a shock um, because we weren't raised in the United States. And I went to UC Berkeley and I studied chemistry. Actually, that was my main degree. You might be surprised to hear that because I'm a qualitative researcher. Um, but the whole time I went to Berkeley, I was working because my parents were not wealthy, and I worked as an interpreter for Japanese American firms, so Japanese and American joint ventures. In particular, I worked at a sake company. It was the first sake making factory in the United States, which was a joint venture with a rice company, an American rice company, and a Japanese sake importer. And I was an interpreter there. And it really was that experience where I really was torn between the Japanese and the Americans, seeing all sorts of cross-cultural conflict going on at the job, that I really became interested in the organizational cross-cultural dynamics. And it was through that I decided to go on after school to become a cross-cultural consultant. And then while I was a cross-cultural consultant, I realized I knew nothing about business. I knew a lot about Japan growing up there, but not about Japanese business. Just because you grow up somewhere doesn't mean you know anything about business. But as I did more consulting, the more I understood that what I didn't know about business. And so I decided to get an MBA so I could be a better consultant. And while I did the MBA, I realized that the MBA in the United States is very, very parochial. And they would teach you things like inventory control, when I knew that in Japan nobody had inventory. It was zero inventory. So why are we learning about inventory control? Or Maslow's needs hierarchy, and how the zenith is self-actualization. Well, I knew that in Japan that wasn't what you would be striving for. In fact, you should be embarrassed if you were going towards self-actualization. So I became even more interested in cross-cultural management and decided to go on for my PhD. So that was my route.
This is fascinating. I mean, you're so accomplished in the field. So I'm really curious about, if you stopped doing what you were doing, what was your second best alternative? What was your second best or fallback plan, the one that you didn't follow?
Well, actually, while I was at Berkeley, I really am right and left brain. So I did chemistry for 3 years. And at the same time, I took literature courses on comparative literature, and ended up actually with a degree in comparative literature. And I had no idea what I would do with that. So I took a psychological placement test that would look at your psychological profile. It's called the Strong Campbell. And it's probably the only quantitative survey that I could put any stock in, because it had a huge database of, tens of thousands of people. And you did a personality test, and they matched your personality with the professions that these people were in. And what was funny about that is that the person administering this test said to me, was very odd, because there aren't a lot of choices for you that you match up with. And I said, well, what's the first choice? And she said, professor. And I thought, I had not really thought about that. And I said, well, okay, well, what's the second choice? And the second choice was veterinarian. And so actually then what I decided to do was to work for a veterinary clinic. And so for 2 years, I worked at a veterinary clinic, because I thought I could go back to school and finish my degree in chemistry and become a veterinarian. But I decided that it wasn't for me. I was quite squeamish. I didn't like to look at the insides of animals and whatnot. And I decided, okay, well, maybe I should think more about, scholarship.
Fascinating. So, I normally ask people something about their regrets. Like I ask them, what's the one thing you wish you would have done that you didn't? What was the biggest failure, and what did you learn from it? But I don't sense any kind of regret here. Everything is coexisting in your life in a very beautiful way, in a very harmonious way. But if you had one regret, what would it be?
Well, on a personal level, I wish I would have had more children, actually. And I was a single mother most of the time. I have a daughter, wonderful daughter, Nora, who's 30 years old now. And at one point, I seriously thought about adopting a daughter from China, actually. And I didn't do it because I didn't think I had the bandwidth of having 2 children as a single mother. But I kind of wish I did. Probably more for my daughter than for me. I wish she had a sibling. So, but on a professional side, the one thing I regret is not publishing my dissertation.
What was the dissertation about?
My dissertation was called "Your Next Boss is Japanese: Negotiating Culture at a Western Massachusetts paper mill." And I actually got a contract from Oxford University Press, Herb Addison, who was a really well-known editor. And but at the time I was at the University of Michigan, and they said, it's not a good idea to publish a book. You need to really be working on journal publications. And so I put it aside, even though I had this wonderful contract from Oxford University Press. And actually, my claim to fame is that you can Google that dissertation, and it has an ISBN number. And even though I never published it, and it's been cited close to 100 times, a book that actually I never wrote. So it's kind of funny, but I think had I been living in Europe or Japan, I would have published that. And to date, people ask me about the dissertation because it was an ethnography, and very, very, I think at the time there was no ethnographic dissertations in business. And so I wish I had published that.
Fascinating. I mean, I will Google it. Definitely. I will look at it. Now let's talk about.
I think you could look it up on Amazon.
Definitely, I will. Right after this, I will. So let's talk about Professor Brannen. And imagine you're stranded in this small village. You sought refuge in a small neighborhood pub. Locals are curious about who you are, what you do for a living, and you need to summarize your research to these people, to this audience, and they ask you, why is this important? So what do you say? How do you explain your research, overall body of research, to people who don't know anything about our field?
Mm-hmm. I think what I do end up saying a lot of the time is that I'm a cultural anthropologist that studies organizations as if they were tribes. So I look at organizations like an anthropologist would look at a cultural group anywhere in the world. And so that usually helps people understand. And then what I say is what I'm interested in is how do people who are coming from very different systems of help, and this is a definition of culture that my first graduate student coined, which is culture is a help system, and that's made up of habits, expectation, language, and perception, help. And that what I think about a lot is how do people who have very different help systems come together to work and to make something together, run an organization together. What are the conflicts? How can I help them understand each other? That's what I say.
If you stayed in Japan, would that dissertation come about, or is this coming out because you were trained in America?
Yeah, it's the one regret about not publishing that book is I think it would have sold well in Japan. The Japanese love to read about themselves, so and how odd they are and the difficulties that they have, and it was quite a success story, this takeover by Japanese management at a time when the movie Gung Ho was out and people were afraid to be taken over by Japanese management. So I think it would have done very well in Japan. In fact, when you asked me that question, I had a memory of something that happened while I was doing my dissertation work, because while I was doing it, I would go back to Japan to interview the home company that took over the Western Massachusetts paper mill. And my daughter at that time was 2 years old, and or no, she was younger than, she was about, just a little bit less than 2 years old, and she would stay with my father and go to a kind of a nursery school while I was doing my research. And one day I went to pick up my daughter, and in Japan, you don't go into the school, you wait in the schoolyard with the other parents, mothers. And while I was doing that, waiting for my daughter, one pretty outspoken Japanese woman asked me, what am I doing here? And I told her I was doing a dissertation. And she said, well, what are you doing your dissertation on? And or what kind of a professor are you going to be? And I said, well, I'm going to be a professor in organization studies. And she said, well, what are you going to teach? And I said, well, we teach things like leadership. And she said, leadership, that's what's wrong with America. You have too many leaders. You teach about leadership, but for 100 people, you only need one leader. And that means that everybody else feels disappointed that they're not a leader. And that one leader feels like he's better than everybody else. And so, that you shouldn't be doing that. You should be teaching followership, And I remember that very well. Yeah.
I have to write this one down, followership.
Well, I've never taught leadership, by the way. After that, I just decided, well, I won't do that.
Followership. This is important. So what are the few omitted variables that maybe we don't cover enough in IB? What do we?
The few, what now?
Omitted variables. What do we omit?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I think there's a lot that we have not looked at that we're looking at more and more now. And I hope that we've made some crossroads into that with John Kettle and I when pushing more of an interdisciplinary perspective in JIBS. But the biggest one is to look at culture as much broader than national culture. And so to look at variance in culture rather than aggregate cultural differences. So value-based culture, definitions of culture. And another one has been to think about language, again, not as national language, but to look at organizational language as well as national language as being quite important. And so rather than language specifics like Arabic or Japanese, to look at language general aspects. What do languages have in common? For example, there's more commonality between English and Chinese. They're both subject, verb, object than say English and Japanese or English and Hebrew, which usually has the verb at the very end, So I think we can become a lot more sophisticated in our variables. It's not so much answering your question about what's missing, more than the sophistication of what we've looked at in the past that I think that is missing. And in terms of variables, I think that what we're missing a lot of is having variables that are really international business variables, dependent variables, that then we have independent variables that are deeper, more sophisticated.
So, I'm trying to figure out how your mind is creating or discovering these interesting things. And there's a process that you're going through. I'm trying to figure out how. So what does your mind think of when it wanders freely in a state of idle curiosity?
Oh, my mind wanders a lot. It's much to the chagrin of my husband, I think. We wake up in the morning at breakfast and he goes, well, how many things have you thought of this morning? And he's just trying to wake up. But my mind really it wanders from one subject to another. And what I guess the biggest thing that guides my mind is our existential thoughts. And from the time I can remember, I was interested in ontological questions. Who are we? I mean, really deep, almost spiritual questions. But I think that's because, one, I'm an introvert, a very strong introvert, and many of us are who are academics. But also, my father was a missionary, and we lived in a house that was the church. He established a church on this small island in the inland sea off the coast of Hiroshima, and he baptized people in the sea, like John the Baptist. But so he was Christian, and the church was in our home, but everyone around me were Buddhist. And so I I believed in God, but I also believed in reincarnation, you know. And so I believed I always had more than one way of answering existential questions.
I see.
And same thing, I grew up bilingually. So I knew a word in Japanese and in English. I knew that we would say itadakimasu, I'm going to eat now. But in English, you would say prayer or something like this. That I always held two different ways of understanding the world. And I think because of that, I just always thought about things like this. And my research trajectory has also been about understanding how is it that this happens, and that I'm an ethnographer makes sense because ethnographers look at try to understand process, understand how does this happen, how can I understand these people.
I mean, in your roles as an editor in JIBS, you've seen a lot of things come and go, right? I would like to ask you what you think is the next big thing in the next 5 to 10 years, and maybe this cultural, the culture of IB scholarship, is it changing to a certain way? Is it a good evolution? Are we headed in any? Um, can you talk to us about what you see as the next phase of IB scholarship going to be like?
Well, I think John and I have talked a lot about that in our editorials, but I really do think interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, mixed methods is clearly where we're at now. And I think a sophistication in the interdisciplinarity. So what that means to me is that we know our field, international business, yet at the same time, we are strong scholars in other fields, or we partner with people who are strong scholars in other fields. So I think we're heading toward an age of more sophistication in terms of the disciplines. And at the same time, in terms of cross-cultural management, I think we're at a time where it's not about crossing cultures as much as intercultural interactions. So I really think cross-cultural management is dead. I think it's more about boundary spanning, about understanding skill sets that the new demographic, meaning people who are multicultural, which is the new demographic. It's very, it's hard to find people these days who you can pinpoint as monocultural, that have not been influenced by lots of different cultures. And so cross-cultural management, old school cross-cultural management, where we think about differences between national cultures, is really dead, and having a lot more sophistication about commonalities across cultures. I worked, I did a project on Tesco, and we worked with 13 Asian managers. And one of the things we did with them, just to understand them better, is we gave them personality or a global citizenship test. And oddly, the most global, the person identified as the most global cosmopolitan was a Thai woman who had never left Thailand, ever, and who didn't speak English very well. But she had worked for Tesco the longest, 13 years. And she answered questions like she wouldn't have any trouble marrying somebody that wasn't from her country, that she enjoyed food from all over the world. So she was really high on global cosmopolitan. So I think in this day of the internet and the, being able to have friends from all over the world without leaving your country, and COVID is making that even sharper. That cultural identity is something that is really changing. So I think that's an important something to think about it as we go forward.
So
A caveat is that I really would rather, I mean, this is just a note to junior scholars and people just entering the field. I'd rather them not think about trends. I think they should think about what they're passionate about, and they'll be trendsetters themselves if they do that.
And this is good because I want to get into the mentoring and advice part of our conversation. When you were starting out, what do you wish you would have known then that would have really helped you along the way?
Wow, I saw that you might ask me this question. And so I thought about it. And one of the things I have to say is that when I started out, I started at the University of Michigan. And I have to say I got wonderful advice there. The only piece of advice I wish I hadn't have gotten was not to finish my book. But outside of that, I really got great advice. A wonderful piece of advice I got was to always have your papers peer reviewed before you send them out for review. And having been an editor for 6 years, I would say that that was really good advice. You should never send an article out without having it reviewed by people in the field beforehand. But I think that I was really lucky in getting very good advice early on. I remember another piece of advice that I got from Jane Denton at the University of Michigan, which was that you might think that you have all these different ideas, but in the end, you'll see that they all come together because it's one person having these ideas. And that kind of ties into what you learn in anthropology, which is that all research is interested, that it comes from a certain interest, and that it's good to be aware of what that interest, where that passion comes from. So,
I mean, if you could label them as skills and capabilities, what type of skills are the most needed going forward in the new IB?
Yeah, I think they're the same skill sets. I think that in my work on biculturals, I found that biculturals, people with multicultural identities have. And one is cognitive complexity. And the idea that you can see the forest as well as the trees. So that you're open to seeing things from a variety of different perspectives. And that's very, very important. And another one is perceptual acuity. And that's almost being able to see things that others take for granted. And many people who are bicultural, who are what I call neither nor biculturals, which is what I was growing up in Japan. I wasn't Japanese, but I wasn't really American because I had never lived in America. People who are neither nor biculturals, neither from here nor from there, tend to be very aware of difference because they want to fit in. So they notice things that are different, and they've been called different all their life. And so being able to notice things, not take for granted things, but notice difference is very important. And finally, to be reflexive, to ask yourself, okay, I'm seeing this happen. How is that different from the way I've been accustomed to doing things, the way we have done things in the past. You know, being reflexive is very important. That, to me, those are the three most important skills.
I mean, you had many students, you've seen many papers, you've seen many scholars come with these papers, submit these papers. What are the top three mistakes that in traditional IB logic, what are the top three mistakes that scholars make that they should avoid?
That they should avoid. Well, one is following trends and not following their passion, not being authentic, you know, and you can tell that in reading a paper right away, that even the author is not interested in their own work. Okay, if that's the case, then why would we be? You know, so you have to motivate a study, and if you've done a study because you thought this is the trend, then it's as opposed for any other reason, then you're going to have a hard time selling it to other people. You know, so I think it's very important to be authentic and passionate. Another is that it's important to, and maybe this is one of the better pieces of advice that I've gotten and I try to give, is to understand that when you're writing to an audience. You're writing to people that are going to read it. And a lot of times people don't think about that. And so it's important to think about, even imagine that you're writing to a certain scholar in the field. Like, imagine you're writing to me, somebody who's an ethnographer, and how are you going to convince me that you've done a good job? You know, or you're joining in a dialogue with people who also are interested in this. That's very important, because a lot of times people are trying to show that they're doing something that nobody has ever done before. Well, then who are they talking to? They should be talking to somebody who's done a part of this before, or, you know, who might be interested in what they've done before. Yeah. And along with that, many PhD students feel like they're worried that somebody else is going to do something before they do it, you know, or they're going to say something before they get a chance to say it. And my advice would be, don't worry about that. No two people will come up with the same ideas and the same conclusions. Even if you're a quantitative researcher. Yeah.
That's good. What's one question that I should have asked you, but I didn't? What is one question that you would insert in this conversation?
Well, given, you know, that I'm a student of culture, and I've worked a lot on cultural identity, I would have thought you would ask me, how do I identify myself culturally?
Okay, how do you identify yourself culturally?
Well, I would say that growing up, you know, I was neither nor. And Japanese called me a gaijin, so I guess I felt like a foreigner. When I came to college, people actually called me an egg. I was white on the outside, yellow on the inside.
That's so funny.
And now I guess I feel like I'm a scrambled egg.
This is funny. Well, Yoko, thank you so much for this interesting and candid interview. I learned a lot, and I'm sure many will agree with me. Thank you for your time and for your advice. Thank you.
It's my pleasure.